Доброго дня всім. Моє ім'я Олена Богдан.
Welcome everybody. I am Olena Bohdan. I am the head of the State Service of the Ukraine for Ethnopolitics and Freedom of Conscience, which is the full title of our institution. Today we are sharing our insights about the religious freedoms and our expertise from 2014 to 22. Together with us, we have scholars, human rights activists, legal scholars, and others who will share their thoughts on the uh, human rights during the war in the occupied territories and in the Crimea, and the cynical attempts by the Russian propaganda to cover the human rights abuses in the territory of Ukraine. We will begin with how the religious communities have actively been engaging in the defense of this country and rendering their help in the crisis situation. The humanitarian work has been going on. This will be the topic of Vyacheslav Horshkov, the coordinator of cooperation with religious communities at our state service for religious conscience. Indeed, the war is a test for the religious communities because it calls for the active display of your thoughts, of your beliefs, of how authentic your beliefs are. When you suffer and the whole country suffers, it only brings to the fore the real nature of the religious organizations. Let me remind you that there are about 37,000 religious communities that adhere to about 100 religious beliefs. And of course, it covers the whole spectrum of the activities. Of course, we have volunteers, we have military, priests, and so on. The churches help us, and of course, they have been quick to respond with their help to provide shelter, food, help the Ukrainian territorial defense, and local self-government institutions. We should look at the principles difference between uh, volunteers and the charity deeds. What comes to mind in the first place is the religious activities that go beyond the Ukrainian borders. For example, the charity organization Caritas Ukraine, that includes about 40 units throughout the Ukrainian territory, unites not only Greek Catholic Church, which is the base of it, but also has been helped by a number of foreign Catholic institutions. They have gathered a lot of resources. These include court aid from the Netherlands or CAFOD from Great Britain. The Ukrainian diaspora has also been active in helping Ukraine in the war time. For example, Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the United States has already gathered about $125,000, and Ukrainian Orthodox Church has already received more than $100,000. These monies go to Mariupol, to Kharkiv, and to the Volyn region. The Baptist Ukrainian organizations have also been helping Ukraine in these stressing times. We have received a lot of help from the humanitarian department of the Evangelical Church, such as mattresses, covers, hygiene, foods, medicines, etc. So far, the evangelists are forming a multifunctional hub where they gather the humanitarian help, which will later on be channeled towards different Ukrainian regions according to their needs. But the work is not going only at the level of the church hierarchy. We see a lot of activities locally. For example, one of the Matviychuk, one of the Orthodox priests, have already, he and colleagues have uh, helped more than 700 to save their lives, and they are sheltering refugees where people receive shower, psychological and medical help. And then they help these people to plan what to do next and how to get to more safe areas of Ukraine, if any. Let me also talk about the charity activities. When we talk about the religious minorities, we know what the major churches are doing, but in Ukraine we have a lot of different denominations. Let me quote from the start. The Ukrainian synagogues and the Ukrainian Jewish centers have announced their readiness to help all the Ukrainians who have been suffering from this war, irrespective of their ethnic or religious identity. This is an example of hospitality, and it should be said that this is what the Ukrainian religious organizations share in general, Muslims of Ukraine from different authorities. If we track this information on the internet, we will see daily the help available from the Congress of Muslims of Ukraine, from the spiritual governance from Crimea that has been registered in the Ukraine controlled territories. Right at the outset of the war, the High Council of Muslims of Ukraine have announced their readiness to provide shelter for people, for as many people as they can host in their basement, to shelter people from bombardments and shellings. The international community of Krishna conscience have given away thousands of portions of food in the Kharkiv metro stations where people were hiding from shellings. The family of Baha'i, they are far away from Kiev, in a relatively safe place where the bombs don't get. They have a center for the summer camps for people, and they have turned this center into the refugee center. The examples abound, but what they are witnessing to is that all the religious organizations, religious communities are showing their best qualities, and together they help the Ukrainians and the foreigners in the Ukrainian territory to overcome the consequences of this terrible war. And they also support the Ukrainian military and the territorial defense. This is a very good news. Thank you. Thank you, Vyacheslav, for sharing your information on the humanitarian work of the religious communities of Ukraine. On the 15th of March, we shared an information on how the Kremlin propaganda covers their cynical ambitions of imperial rule, and how they don't talk about how they are ruining religious sites and churches. As of today, our service has received a data of at least 44 religious buildings that have been damaged or destroyed in at least 7 regions of Ukraine. On some occasions, the buildings have been destroyed completely, some of them partly damaged. For example, when the shreds of the remnants of the rockets are hitting buildings. In the 7 regions of Ukraine where we have Kyiv, Zhytomyr, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, Kharkiv, and Chernihiv regions. In the majority of the cases, it was the Orthodox churches and cathedrals that suffered, plus 3 Protestant churches, 3 synagogues, one Catholic church, and one Muslim center of praying. I would like to give the floor to our colleagues with the coordinator of the roundtable discussion. She will talk about the egregious cases when people are kidnapped or killed. Ms. Oleksandra, the floor is yours. Together with the colleagues and the Institute for Religious Freedom are tracking down the human rights abuses beginning since 2014 as the Russian aggression began. Even then, in Donetsk and Lugansk and in the Crimea, we saw the purposeful attacks against the different religions. In the Crimea, it led to a situation when most of the religious communities were forced to cease their existence, and the freedom of consciousness ceased to exist as a phenomenon. Well, religious organizations that people adhere to, if it is loyal to the Russian Secret Service, then such a religious community is allowed to function. Otherwise, it is repressed, and they're called terrorists, and so on. Currently, we see that religious persecutions are increasing. My colleagues will be talking about the destruction of the spiritual heritage of Ukraine. And by the way, irrespective of the religious confessions, these buildings are indiscriminately targeted. We also see the persecution of the religious persons. At the Maidan source w- web, we published information on the 16th of March. It is important that the appeal was signed by religious organizations, by public organizations. I will cite a couple of examples for you to understand what we are dealing with. For example, Vasil Verezuk on the 27th of February was aboard of the vessel Sophia, was kidnapped by the Russian military. Epiphany, the head of the Orthodox Church, his monastery was broken into on the 1st of March. A head of the monastery was killed in the village of Grabiev. On the 2nd of March, a Ukrainian Orthodox priest was killed, and at the time of killing, he was wearing his religious garments. The father, Rostislav Dudarenko, was killed in this village of Vernogorodka on the 5th of March. A teacher of Greek language, Oleksandra Kisnyuk, was kidnapped on the 9th of March in Mariupol in Donetsk region. Russian military have kidnapped a local pastor and his brother, and they are rearing 10 foster children. The military priest was killed the next day on the 14th of March in the house of Oleg Nikolaev, from the occupied Berdyansk. That priest was arrested and kidnapped. The list could go on, but it is important to note that the participants of the round table on religious freedom of Ukraine and other organizations that signed the petition, they call on the UN countries to turn and call on the Russian Federation to end the war against Ukraine and to free all the Ukrainian citizens who have been imprisoned because of their religious views. We call on other Orthodox churches that are united with the Moscow Patriarchate to sever their ties with that part of Orthodox Church because they are unconditionally supporting Russia's aggression. We call for the Russian Church to be excluded from the church communities because they are supporting the ideology of the Russian irredenta, and of course the interfaith organizations must publicly call on the Russian Federation to stop the war and to condemn their position of supporting Russia's aggression. So, Alexandra, thank you. When we talk about the Russian intrusion of 2022, we can't avoid talking about what we have seen since 2014, when the Russian Federation illegally occupied Crimea and eastern regions of Ukraine. We've been monitoring situation all of this time, and we are now seeing a number of tendencies that are pointing towards what we can expect in the future. In the Crimea, as Alexander had suggested, everyone who is not cooperating with the occupying force, everybody who is not supporting the occupying administration, they have been marginalized or banned. So from the start, the control upon the religious life has been very tough and restrictive. It has led to the lessening and decrease of the religious spectrum. Before the occupation on the Crimean Peninsula, there were at least 2,020 religious organizations representing at least 43 religious denominations. As of the end of 2020, the Russian Federation informed that there are 907 religious organizations representing about two dozen denominations. So both denominations and the number of religious organizations have decreased by half. We are seeing a very complex situation with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. During the occupation, the activities of the church has been brought to the brink of annihilation. The Crimean part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church included 25 departments, but at the beginning of the 2022, this part also only includes 4 priests with 7 parishes. So we see the 6-time decrease in parishes and 3 times a threefold decrease in the number of priests. In other words, this church is at the risk of being fully pulled away from the Crimea unless the Ukrainian authorities have resumed their control over the territory. And of course, they are trying to damage the Ukrainian Orthodox Cathedral in Yevpatoria, which is in contravention of the European rights for human rights. The Jehovah's Witnesses has been banned. In 2017, the High Court of the Russian Federation deemed the Jehovah's Witnesses to be an extremist organization. 5 people representing Jehovah's Witnesses have been jailed, and a number of 2 of them are under the house arrest. The Witnesses of Jehovah are very well known in Ukraine. They're free in their actions in the Ukrainian territory. Of course, throughout the world, this organization enjoys a reputation of a peaceful organization that has nothing to do with the extremist organization. The label of extremists have also been put on the Crimean Tatars, who are predominantly Muslims. And here we see the intertwining of religious and ethnical identities. This is why they are so heavily persecuted in the Crimea. People are arrested for the illegal missionary activities. This is their main brand of arresting people for illegal missionary activities. So we see that Muslims and representative Crimean Tatars are being persecuted. We think It has to do with the fact that the Crimean Tatars has been very active in supporting the idea of returning the Crimea towards the Ukrainian control and for the Crimean Peninsula to be part of the Ukraine or Ukraine state. Of course, in Ukraine, religious communities are free to profess their religion publicly, not only within the territories of their organizations. However, today, this article cover in the Russian Federation that talks about the contravention of the freedom of conscience, together with Muslims, the Protestants, the Baptists, Jews, and in particular, this article has been imposed upon the Ukrainian Orthodox priest. This situation was egregious because the uh, the uh, service took place in the territory of a private monastery. A number of decrees were passed in Russia, and they're fining people for at least 370,000 Russian rubles. In all, the number of fines for illegal missionary activities amounts to 2 million Russian rubles. One of the pretexts to persecute people is the fight against Hakrir Muslim organization. This is a handy way for the propaganda to incarcerate people who they think, because security-wise, this organization is treated very carefully in other countries. In Ukraine, they were not deemed as extremist organization, but uh, if they find the Quran and religious material, they immediately claim that this organization is an extremist one, and people are put behind bars. Human rights organizations have recorded a number of occasions when Muslims are persecuted, and in majority of cases they are Crimean Tatars. In Crimea, we also are seeing that the contents of the sermons in the mosques is heavily monitored. They're dictated what kind of sermon can be delivered, and the law enforcement and special secret service of Russia and the occupying authorities are tracking down these messages once they go beyond what has been allowed to them. Ms. Alexandra, let me give the floor to you to talk about the breaches of human rights in the eastern part of Ukraine, in the occupied territories since 2014. I think Alexandra is not available. She's not available. Maksym, Vasin, I would like to give the floor to you. Mr. Vasin is Executive Director of the Institute for Religious Freedom. Together with Oleksandra Matviychuk, he has been monitoring the situation with human rights in the temporarily occupied territories. Welcome, everybody, our viewers, our listeners, everybody who sympathizes with Ukraine, who supports Ukraine, stands together with Ukraine. The Institute for Religious Freedom has been acting for 2 decades, and over the last 8 years, of course, we are focusing our attention on the monitoring of breaches of human rights, breaches of religion in the occupied territories of Ukraine, in Crimea, in the Donetsk and Lugansk parts, regions, those parts that are controlled by the Russian Federation. As my colleague had suggested about Crimea, in the territories of Donbass, that is to say, Russia-controlled parts of the Lugansk and Donetsk regions, we see a negative, sharp decrease after the Russian occupation. Prior to 2014, representatives of different religious organizations, confessions, and denominations were free to gather at the central parts in the city, participate in Easter marches, to participate in the children's rights, and show their services and to provide their sermons in a free way. After the Russian occupation, all the legislation that Russia has imposed on the occupied territories in the so-called People's Republics. Some of these republics, and I mean self-proclaimed Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, have copied the anti-terrorism legislation verbatim from the Russian one, although the title is different. They are persecuting religious minorities. Of course, the so-called legislation has nothing to do with legality, with justice, or uh, just treatment of people. These legislation were only a formal pretext to engage in religious persecutions. The same goes as for the official statistics at the beginning of the 2014. In the Donetsk region in particular, there were almost 1,800 religious organizations, 762 Orthodox communities within the realm of Russian Orthodoxy. So the Moscow Patriarchate was represented by about 42%. That is to say, almost a majority. So the message by the Russian propaganda that they would come to this country and save the Russian Orthodoxy have nothing to do with reality. They don't need to be defended. They are the majority. What we have seen over the last 8 years, the Russians have persecuted in the first place Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church, evangelical churches such as the evangelists and Pentecostals, Baptists, Adventists, and other evangelical churches, the Latter-day Saints, Mormons, were so much persecuted. There is not a single acting community, and the halls of gatherings were confiscated by the occupying authorities. The same goes for the Jehovah's Witnesses. They were recognized to be extremists and they were persecuted by the occupying forces in the Donetsk region. Similarly, a couple of examples that we know, Baptists, for example, have been recently recognized as extremists, especially their literature. What we see is a purposeful politics of the occupying Russian politics to root out everything that is Ukrainian, everything that does not serve the support of the occupying Russia's regime. What we are seeing now, after the Russia invasion, the specific targets for the Russian soldiers are priests and churches. Now we even see the instances when the Russian military aim not at a particular religious minorities, but rather at destruction of the Ukrainian nation as a whole, the Ukrainian cultural heritage. we can talk about the signs of genocide of the Ukrainian people. And we expect the United Nations International Criminal Court that has ordered already Russia to stop the military actions. But I hope that in the near future, the Russian authorities will be found responsible for the genocide of the Ukrainian people during the invasion that is currently raging on. We see that the churches are destroyed, chaplains are persecuted, all other priests are persecuted, those that serve their communities of different denominations. All in all, people who adhere to some kind of religion are suffering in no less volume than the peaceful population of Ukraine. However, the priests become a primary target for the Russian soldier, and they are believed to be of some danger to them. And the firings and executions, kidnappings, hostage taking, searches, and the use of some religious buildings by the Russian soldiers at their sites and their launching pads for artillery bombings. We should also mention that the Russian religious figures also share the responsibility for unleashing the war against Ukraine by Russia. At the Institute of Religious Freedom, we are keeping track and record the claims, statements of different religious persons around the world. We see a special role of the Russian Orthodox Church and its head, Patriarch Kirill, who unequivocally supports President Putin and his aggression against Ukraine, and he justifies this action in his letter to the World Council of Churches, spreading the Russian propaganda and their messages. He talks about and doesn't tell anything about the fact that civil infrastructure, peaceful cities, maternities, churches are bombed by the by the Russian Federation and by the people who claim to be Russian Orthodox. He doesn't say a single word about that, the Moscow Patriarch Kirill. Muslims, leaders, their muftis in Russia have also, unfortunately, supported Putin's aggression. This is a sad thing. The evangelical churches in Russia, either directly or indirectly, have supported Russia's aggression. On the website of the Russian, of Christian evangelicals, we see the information where they share the Russian propaganda on some special operation in Ukraine about the threat, supposedly the threat that Ukraine poses to Russia. Some claims that we hear from the rest of other religious actors in Ukraine don't serve the reconciliation. We should call evil evil, and otherwise the good cannot be compromised with the evil. What is sin is a sin, what evil is an evil. The spade should be called a spade, and they first should uh, accept their responsibility and take the responsibility for what they're doing here in Russia, because they support Russia's war. And of course, in no small part, instead of repenting and confessing, they are supporting the war. On the other hand, we are thankful to the voices of those people around the world and the religious organizations who stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. We receive a lot of messages, both Ukrainian religious authorities and our Institute for Religious Freedom. And in the public domain, we are keeping record of these messages of support. The Ukrainian Council of Religions, almost on a daily basis, publishes different statements. On the eve of the Russian invasion, on the 23rd of February, the Ukrainian Council of Churches has condemned Russia's war, called it a sin and a crime and a great sin against God. Later on, religious uh, leaders of Ukraine called on the Russian Federation to stop the war, to stop the bombardment of the civil infrastructure, to free the prisoners of war, or to swap prisoners of war, to clothe the Ukrainian sky, so provide the anti-air defense systems. The All Ukrainian Council of Churches encompasses about 95% of different Catholic, Greek Catholic, uh, Protestants, Muslims, and Jews. And it testifies to the fact that in Ukraine there is a religious freedom, there is a understanding between different denominations. We don't have religious, purposeful persecutions. And even if there are people that are repressed, the Ukrainian courts are free to provide protection and defense to those believers and religious communities that may feel some difficulties. This cannot be said about Donbass, about the occupied Donbass, Lugansk, or Crimea, or in the Russian Federation for that matter. So all these claims are groundless. So the stance of the Ukrainian religious community is this. In Ukraine, there is an interfaith peace. All denominations are free to confess their religions, and all of us call upon the Russian Federation to get away from Ukraine. And this will help to restore peace in Ukraine and for us to be able to live in peace and for all the denominations to function freely in free Ukraine. Thank you, Maksym. We have seen that while the Russian Patriarch Kirill has actually supported the Russian war against Ukraine, many religious leaders around the world have come forward to condemn this war and supported Ukraine. We'll be talking about the international response now, and we'll listen to Kostyantyn Sihov, who is the director of the Center for European Humanitarian Studies at the National University Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. He is also a consultant on religion and strategic planning of the Ukrainian Service for Freedom of Conscience and Religions. Thank you. The State Service for Ethnopolitics and Freedom of Religion is keeping track of what's going around the world in terms of the discussion that my colleagues have engaged in. In particular, we see the personal positions of some people, and we go over to a more general sphere. More than 300 leading religious scholars have condemned the idea of Russian world, the so-called Russian irredenta. It was done in Greek and other religious centers in Europe, United States, and in Ukraine. In particular, this address says, we condemn the heresy of the Russian Orthodox Church and their support of the aggression against Ukraine that cannot be justified. This is a deeply unchristian, unorthodox, and repulsive. This declaration states that truth is important for Christians, for all people of goodwill, of any religion, of any personal conviction, in order to support peace and condemning the lies, because the uh, slyness of the Russian Orthodox is to no good. On the 13th of March, that's a symbolic day, the week of Orthodoxy. If listeners and our audience would like to sign this declaration, support it, you have such a possibility on the website of Athens. It has been translated by Father Kulchansky into Ukrainian. He has also provided some very insightful comments on that. It creates a new context. The initiative group, the God Against War, a world discussion about the Russia-Ukraine war. It has not to be marginalized. They have created a internet platform where they publish voices from Ukraine and voices towards Ukraine, that is in Ukrainian and in foreign languages. The discrepancy between the words and the deeds is something we feel very keenly. That's why the project is called Athens in Practice in the Time of War. It has been run by the Kyiv-Mohyla University and other universities in Europe. The state service for religious freedom and freedom of consciousness is cooperating with different institutions around the world. It helps us to witness about the values that are the basis for our activities, our our defense, and the Ukrainian voice can be and must be heard at the level of the World Council of Religions, the Episcopal conferences of Europe, and other leading countries in the world. In order for this communication to take place, in spite of all the barriers of war between the world and Ukraine, everyone is welcome to participate in that project, and I thank you for your attention.
Дуже дякуємо, пане Костянтине.
Thank you, Mr. Konstantin Seagull.
Зараз відбувається
Now
надзвичайно велика кількість комунікацій
we
з
are
різними
engaged in a number of communications in different realms and spheres. The religious scholars are cooperating. I would like to give the floor to Liudmyla Fylypovych, who is the vice president of the Ukrainian Association of Religious Studies. She will share with us her thoughts and insights. Dear friends, welcome our viewers. I am now in the Bukovina region in the western part of Ukraine, so my view will be quite local, in spite of the fact that the Chernivetsky region is the smallest in geographical terms in the territory of Ukraine. You have to believe me how much work is being done here. The Chernivtsi has become the so-called hub of Ukraine because very many refugees come to this city and they are trying to get children and women across the border, and they feel the support of many religious organizations to hold them, to help them. You will know that Chernivtsi is on the border with Romania, so the main direction of these people is towards Romania. Any religion organization is based on good deeds. And of course, religion organizations didn't have to wait for some guidelines. Once they have heard about the war, they realized right there the special types of conditions, the special challenges that they faced. And the citizens of Chernivtsi have been very genius. They have been very active, and they even took offense at what Arestovich had said. He said that people are trying to buy their time. They're not doing everything it takes. It doesn't concern my city, Chernivtsi. We have doubled down on what we were doing before. People understand that a lot of things depend not only this overall success in the war, but the city views herself at the center of charity activities. This is a very specific, a complex. This is the combination of Protestant and Orthodoxy. Catholics are not very numerous here, but Protestants have become the most dynamic community in terms of helping people who come to Chernivtsi, to this region. Actually, all the prayer houses have become the so-called spiritual and physical hotels for the newcomers. People are invited to the local residents' flats. I know people who are now hosting in their flats 10, 12 people. They don't charge them financially, they help them in whatever possible way they can. People are fleeing the situation where they have lost everything. They pray together, and there's one interesting thing. You come to the Adventists or Pentecostals, you will find everybody here, Jews, Catholics, Christians, and unbelievers. That is to say, at the door of the cathedral, you are not asked, do you belong? Which church do you attend? Because everyone is praying with some differences, beginning with our Father who art in heaven. But I am sure that God hears us all because it is done with open hearts and it is done with a deep conviction and faith. God will help us overcome all the challenges we are facing. I have met representatives of the Council of Religions Organizations in the Chernivtsi region. Now I've been very closely connected with the secretary of this council, Mr. Chernushka. He is a Adventist himself, and through his charity organization, ABRA, they have helped thousands of people to Romania. Romanians, by the way, have shown the miracles of help. They place our people in summer camps, in sanatoria, in their religious institutions. People are taken, as it were, right there at the border and invited to people's houses. We should think about setting up such coordination centers, as some people suggest. At this time, in point in time, every religious organization, again, they have a historical background and so on. They do their best. I will not go into detail. I will share with you proposals that the religious organizations have put forward. This may help, this where we can get some help from the state. We are proposing to engage those sites that, for example, in our region are not functioning. For example, one of the hotels which is not functioning, it can host more than 1,000 persons. Of course, it's not functioning. The government might invest some money into that. It can provide absolutely normal and decent conditions. There are restaurants that are able to help feed people. And now again, we need some help from the state. Those who are transferring humanitarian help, they are asking for the easing of the procedures at the border. Apart from medicines, they are bringing to Ukraine some foods that can expire. We need the ministry to make an order. If this is humanitarian help, it must go through the simplified customs procedures. There are some restrictions on for people aged from 18 to 60 years. Religious organizations are now lacking people drivers who can get people across the border, but these drivers must be over 60 years old. At the level of the local authorities, we must come with the list of people, trusted people who are sure to come back, because people are claiming that sometimes you have to bribe the authorities to become a volunteer. This is an absurd situation. Let us think together, Ms. Olena. Could we come forward with an initiative for some ages to have some easings? Because, if we have a 65-year-old driver, it's difficult for them to be for 72 hours a day en route. There must be some indulgence for them, give them easing prescriptions, because everybody wants to participate, wants to take part in this process. I think that my colleagues were making a very good point. Today, religion freedom is facing colossal challenges, and it is under great threat. What we are saying now in the religious minorities terms, we have a huge database, and about 80% of the network has been lost. People are killed, people are leaving Ukraine, cities are bombed, and these re- religious minorities are feeling the lack of resources. It will be a great challenge for them to recuperate, because they provided for the plurality of religious life in Ukraine. They were witnessing to the fact that in Ukraine they enjoyed religious freedom. As for the Ukrainian Association of Religious Scholars, we are closely cooperating with the international institutions right from the start of the war. The European Religious Scholars Association, European Association of Sociology of Religion, they come forward with different projects for our scholars to come to them to read lectures and so on. We are now putting together this information for our scholars to take advantage of. Now, of course, you will be aware that only female scholars can use these opportunities, because men cannot go beyond the Ukrainian borders at the moment. I am sure that we will do our best to preserve all the achievements we had so far, and perhaps we will also be increasingly stronger in providing for the religious freedom in Ukraine, to show once again that we are a civilized European country. Thank you. I would like now to call upon the religious organizations and other organizations, say, of secular character. If you have problems, you have to do with the social policy ministry as far as the humanitarian help is concerned. Don't hesitate to come to our service too, because we are in close contact with the ministry responsible. We need to have an updated information. We need to know the contact person, what kind of weight is in the truck, and we will make sure that we control the situation. We will help you. Dear colleagues, when in 2014 the eastern part of Ukraine was being occupied, in the Donetsk, until the last possible moment, there was a prayer for Ukraine that was joined by different religions. And we have today with us a participant of that prayer, Mr. Kozlovskyi. At the end of the day, these events don't take place anymore. Occupying force did not allow, and Ihor was himself was taken as a prisoner in that region. Mr. Ihor, I give the floor to you. I am also looking at what's going on here through the prism of my experience in 2014 and 15. I'm an engaged observer and a scholar and an immediate participant. I can tell you that Russia and Russian soldier and Russian regime in general has never adhered to the rules of war or any international agreements on the humanitarian rights or the freedom of conscience or religious convictions. From the very beginning, they were setting up a repressive machine in order to destroy, this is the word, to destroy and bully the peaceful population, to ruin not only military sites or structures, but in the first place, they targeted their blows in order to ruin and to damage and to bring down religious buildings and sites. I would call it a signature feature of today's war against Ukraine, the uh, taking religious buildings, kidnapping of priests and people, torture and persecution of those who think otherwise in general, and banning of any activities which is deemed by the Russian occupying authority to be a challenging force to them. It also includes encouragement of both believers and non-believers to collaborations of some sorts. We saw that in 2014, either it was a forced collaboration or active collaboration with the occupiers, or creating the system of informers, which is very active in the occupied territories, serving the occupying regime. For example, in 2014, representatives of practically all active denominations in the Donetsk region united their efforts in the praying marathon. We were standing under the Ukrainian banners even after the so-called Strelkov regiment entered the city, and basically until the August 14th, then we went underground, and as an underground organization we functioned until November 2014, when the so-called local police began to arrest what has been left of our participants of this religious marathon. But religious marathon also implied helping each other. It was an interfaith volunteer work. We were saving people from the basements, from the those who were taken prisoners. In other words, it was a common endeavor, common work of people united f- for the cause of Ukraine, although they represented different denominations. Catholics were helping Muslims were helping, uh, Protestants, Catholics were helping, Orthodox believers. And for that, 17 people of this prayer marathon suffered. Some of them were kidnapped, They were arrested, beaten, and taken into captivity. I was kept captive for almost 2 years. And of course, there is a difference here. If in 2014 different Russian uh, now we see something different because they are targeting, because they're targeting Ukrainian life in general. They want to destroy everybody who they think don't con- don't coincide with the ideology of the Russian world, Russian irredenta. As for the occupied territories, they have created a repressive system, a system that, in my view, was then an experiment of transposing it into a further territory of Ukraine. They were testing different methodologies. My personal experience as a captive, I can tell you that this system is working automatically. These include illegal persecution, banning of any free thought, a thought that is different from the ideology of the Russian world. Even the the sign that you are interested in something that relates to Ukraine is an indication for the authorities to persecute such people. If you even mention that life in Ukraine is better than in the occupied territories, will lead to arrests, illegal arrests, illegal uh, keeping of people in detention, unfit for a decent life, isolation camps. There are a couple of isolation camps running. This is done to bully and frustrate people, to um, frighten and terrorize people who are still thinking in Ukrainian terms. They have also created a system of informers that reminds us of what's of the great terror in the Soviet Union in the 1936 and 37. The places where the detainees are kept are always places where you are tortured, psychologically tortured and physically tortured. And of course, killings and the imitation of execution and executions themselves. This system has been transposed and imposed upon the territories occupied by the aggressor. The representatives of different religious denominations are suffering, and they're suffering because they're different from the believers that are typical for the Russian Federation. They're different because they believe to be Ukrainians, they believe that they are free, they have tasted the taste of freedom and the freedom of religion, something that for the Russian Federation is unabashed. What they say, this is a very uh, daring attempt that must be crushed. The totalitarian system requires uniformity. Everybody must confess some myths that are common for everybody in the Russian Federation under the name of the Russian world. So what we are seeing now can be called the development of what had begun back in 2014, but in a more global way. I would call it a challenge for the civilized world in general. In my view, we are seeing the war of civilizations. This is the war of civilizations because we represent the civilization of freedom. We know what freedom is. We represent civilization that is humane, that is plural, that expound the idea of plurality. But what the Russian irredenta is based upon is the revanchist ideology of slavery, where people are deprived of any decency. This is a revanchism ideology. So the voices from around the world in support of the Ukrainian believers and the Ukrainian people is very important. It must be growing stronger and stronger. People must be called upon to support Ukraine, to share the truth of what's going on in Ukraine. International community should be aware of that. Thank you.
Дякую, Ігорю Анатолійовичу. У
Thank you,
міжнародній
Igor.
комунікації ми постійно
In the
повторюємо,
international
що
communication,
війна
we
Росії
constantly
проти України це війна
underline that
тоталітарного
this war of Russia
авторитарного
against
режиму
Ukraine
Росії
is
проти
a
терористів
repressive,
України.
authoritarian
Ця
war
війна триває
regime fighting the
прямо в
democratic
Європі
one.
і бореться
This
за
war is raging on in the
простір
center of
свободи
Europe.
та за
By
простір
fighting
свободи
for
слова,
Ukraine,
за простір
you are
свободи
fighting for the
інформації.
freedom of space of freedom
Дозвольте
in
запитати
Europe and in
наших
the world.
колегів
I would
Укрінформу.
like
Скажіть, будь
to
ласка,
ask
чи
my
я правильно розумію,
colleagues from
що
the
ми вже завершили
Ukrinform
запитання
agency.
і
Am I right in
можемо
understanding that we
передати
don't have
слово
any more
для
questions
коментаря одному
and
з наших
we
спікерів?
can give the floor for additional comments to one of our panelists?
Пане Костянтине.
Mr. Kostyantyn, the floor is yours. Thank you. I would like to share with you the following. Beginning since the 24th of February, I've been commenting online for the French, American, Canadian TV channels, what's going on here. And I thought it was very important that apart from the fact that Ukraine is being killed and is being ruined, I thought it made sense to talk about what is the reason of this war and of our line of defense. And when we talk about the peaceful house in Ukraine, because Ukrainian resistance is very important. People should understand the mosaics of life, the ethnic plurality, Greek people from Mariupol, uh, Crimean Tatars, Ukrainians, and other ethnics. Whatever ethnic identity they enjoy, they must be supported by the world solidarity. That's why it is important for the people in the world to listen to not only horrendous news about the war when they're seeing online this cold blood killings in Ukraine. People should be also aware of the fact that the war began since the annexation of Crimea and the hurricanes that this country has suffered. We have withstood them. I also know that in the world, people know that in spite of the fact that that this war is in war, on the 2nd of March, there was a cross mounted in the center of Kyiv, and people are not afraid to come to it and to talk openly about their human decency, about what has been going on in Ukraine. This is very important. I think with our common effort, with our concerted actions, something that we've been doing for last 30 years, these values, the values of openness, humanity, and decency, this is the basis of our life. And this will provide for the solidarity with the Ukrainian people at every possible level. And I would like to thank participants of the ETHET project that we are
Дякую, пане
now
Костянтине.
putting
Хочу подякувати
together.
всім експертам за
Thank
допомогу.
you, Konstantin. I would like
Тому що
to
побудувати
thank all
сценарій
the
відстоювання
panelists.
потенціалу
We've
агресія
built
Російської
together
Федерації
a
для звільнення
panoramic
спільноти України,
view
починаючи з
of the
2014 року.
implications of
І
the
як
Russian war for the
коментували
religious
вже
communities.
отримали
And
результат,
If Ukrinform confirmed that we don't have any more questions, we will wrap this meeting up. Thank you.
Дякуємо, на все добре.
Thank you very much and take care of yourselves.